The first shark bite mitigation strategy was implemented in New South Wales in 1937, where they deployed shark nets off the city port Sydney. Subsequently, in 1962, Queensland deployed shark nets, and in recent years, we've had the spate of shark bites in Western Australia and South Australia, and that has now also led to mitigation programs in place. And I will detail some of those over the course of my presentation. The question, of course, always is, well, why is shark bite such a big deal? These data are from Australia, and you can see that sharks kill far fewer people than even a horse. Personally, I don't like using these sorts of comparisons because we're talking about people who are in the water. However, you see here, even drowning far exceeds the number of people killed by sharks. And yet, when people are finally killed by a shark, it reaches the media, usually a very sensationalist terminology, as you can see on the right-hand side. And interestingly enough, we had a fatality at Bribie Island in Queensland earlier this year, and I was amazed. In 24 hours, I had 55 alerts from 10 countries and 2 web-based magazine articles. So it just highlights the public interest in this particular topic. A couple of years ago, we had a fatality of an ocean swimmer in Sydney region, and it was amazing the amount of coverage it got, and some of the media were using very detailed figures in the newspapers, etc., to explain exactly what had happened. So it really just highlights how the public interest is fueled by this type of media coverage. So the reality is, and I think my colleagues beforehand have spoken about it already, but we really have only 3 species of shark that come close to shore that interact with people and bite. It's white sharks, tigers, and bull sharks. It's really interesting with the numerous tagging programs conducted by laboratories around the world, and many of our colleagues are sitting here at the moment. You realize that particularly those 3 sharks are traveling large distances, especially on continental areas, and I think it's really important to see Sebastian's research with tagging, etc., to make that comparison between Réunion and the rest of the world in the continental areas, because you may have something slightly different here. But in Australia, the tags that my colleague Paul Butcher, for example, to be putting out of smart download programs suggest that white sharks are traveling in excess of 10,000 kilometers a year. Bull sharks are at about 5,000 kilometers a year. So they are traveling very large distances. And the reason why we are interested in tagging these animals is not just as a biological interest and ecological interest, but also to try to understand what are the factors involved when they do interact with people, when there are bites. So you're overlaying movements of animals with environmental conditions. And that really allows us then to start analyzing risk and conducting detailed risk analyses. And most of us here are involved in a study with Viri Niela, who actually came here and worked on the Réunion data with the Kill team a few years ago. So he's been modeling it up to that work will come up quite soon. When we look at Australia, so what I've done for a lot of the presentation is the Australian coastline like this, and I will be talking about each of the states. And what is interesting is that when we look at the shark attacks that have happened, it really just it sort of mirrors where you would expect these different species to be. So the red for example, white sharks. And you can see most of the white shark bites are in the south of the country, in the cooler water. To the north, Queensland and the northern part of Western Australia, Northern Territory, that tends to be bull sharks and tiger sharks, which is not surprising because that's where the greater distribution of those animals are. When we overlay, as I was saying, when you look at the data, we try to overlay the environmental conditions, we found that bull sharks bites tend to happen close to rivers, within 1 kilometer of a river. Generally, there's an increased chance of being bitten. Tiger sharks push the rainfall, so a good idea at the moment after the cyclone that you've actually flows down the beaches, as an example. And for white sharks, we had an interesting situation where we had temperature anomaly, which basically means that there was really warm water offshore, but there was a thin little area of cool water, and that was an upwelling where ocean currents were creating more plankton and more animal life potentially, and that's where white shark bites tend to happen. So you could definitely look at the environmental conditions that occur at the time of the shark attacks. Our colleagues, Paul Butcher and his team, looked at the survivability of victims after shark fires. And I think you've all spoken about it in the last 24 hours that we've been here. But we've really all come to the same conclusion, particularly the labs in California, how important rapid response is to a shark bite. And we find that survivorship after a shark bite dramatically increases with the quickness in which the victim is just assisted. And you can see again the fatalities of white sharks are about, survivorship of white sharks are about 53%, so it's about half of the people survive white shark bite, whereas bull sharks is 62% and tiger 75%. So tiger shark survival rate is actually quite high, 75%. A lot of the fatalities in Australia, you could see on the map, are up in the very north of Queensland, where the pointy part is. I'll actually use a pointer. Who's looking at which screen? Okay, that's that area over there. That's where the fatalities are. I'll give it up there. Okay, thanks. But yeah, basically that's a long way away from any large towns and any ability to deal with the trauma in the hospitals. I will be going around the coast now, starting in the Northern Territory and working in a clockwise direction and ending up talking about Western Australia. So in the Northern Territory, there is no shark at that one. Yes, there is the shark bite mitigation measures. They have had bites over the years, but they're relatively few. The big issue there is crocodiles. And the crocodile thing will be about education. And as we've spoken about here as well, education is undoubtedly incredibly important. And we, certainly in our case in New South Wales, education has been a very large focus for our shark management strategy. But it's interesting that there is no shark bite mitigation strategy in the Northern Territory. On the other hand, in Queensland, we've had shark heads since 1962. They have also been fishing the drum lines. You can see the number of nests and drum lines and table underneath. And you can see that there is a huge number of drum lines that lay increased in recent years after a review in 2018 about the use of nets within Siley Reef Park, the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park, and it was decided that they would use nets. And these are traditional drum lines, the same drum lines that are being used at KwaZulu-Natal. that you just heard Matt talking about. So it's they also have been trialing what they call catch alert drumlines, or what most of us know as spark drumlines, the ones that were invented here in Urion. And that will continue until June, and probably will continue after that, I would imagine. And they've been doing quite a lot of drone work in recent times, following the work that we've been doing in New South Wales. If we look at their drumline program, the catch alert drumlines, so the smart drumlines, you can see that the target species made up a big percentage of the catch, and they decided to continue to extend the trials and to additional regions. So that's good news in the long term. Additionally, the drone trials have had some good results. They've only had 4 beach evacuations during the time that they've done that. So people say, well, what use is it? Because they're not really seeing the sharks. But I think it's very clear from our word, but in New South Wales, and I think Paul from it, we talk about that later on, that the drones are an incredibly effective program for us. We talked about New South Wales. We initiated the 2015 shark management strategy of the series of sites as the northern New South Wales, 2014-15. We trialed a lot of different technologies, including helicopters, which the orange tick shows that it works, but it's expensive, and we're not using it anymore. The green tick shows that it works, and it's being used at the moment. And you can see under personal protection, there's binoculars in orange. Basically means that we are watching the space. It's not necessarily really for large-scale deployment in our case. You can see there's quite a few areas here. Clever Buoy, which is a sonar system that was designed to try to detect incoming sharks. We found that did not work, and the barriers, which are made out of plastic that we use in Western Australia, quite successfully, that was well suitable for our very dynamic coastline. In addition to all of this, we still have 51 beaches with the traditional shark nets, same as what is used in KwaZulu-Natal. Burnt mackerels is about. So what does the strategy now look like? You can see there's the coast on the right-hand side. We have 25 local government authorities, and of those, we cover pretty much every LGA with some sort of mitigation strategy. The 51 beaches of nets as of the end of this month. The nets will be coming out 1 month early. That's as a result of ongoing concern catches of leatherback turtles. So that's a bycatch mitigation measure. We're putting the nets out for 1 month early. Spot drumlines, you go 305 and 19 of the LGAs. So we have these things called target shark listening stations, which Paul will give you more details of, but we've got 37 of those, which basically, in a nutshell, inform you of when a tagged shark swims within about 500 meter radius of the listening station, and you get an alert on a specially designed app for your mobile device. We now have 50 beaches covered with drones. We have trauma kits and incident response educational programs that have been run out at 150 surf lifesaving clubs and surfing clubs. And of course, we have the Shark Spot app, which includes a lot of our research outcome. So it's been a huge program, and Dr. Paul Butcher will provide more details on that. If we go around the coast a little bit to the south, we get to a state called Victoria. There's been no fatality there for 35 years. and there's absolutely no shark bite mitigation program, with the exception of the fisheries website, which gives all the old messaging that we've been seeing for the last 40 years, maybe. So yeah, that probably needs a bit of an update. But it's also important to note that 70% of the population of Victoria live in Melbourne, and Melbourne is a city that is on a big inland waterway, for want of a better word, a big embayment, and I think the chances of large, potentially dangerous white sharks coming into that waterway is probably slim. I'll defer to Dr. Uvenius to pass more comment on from that at some stage. Any questions? South Australia, which is up to years home to it, has just announced $500,000 that the government has put into a shark bite management strategy, which pretty much all of the money has gone to surf fire saving South Australia, and it's used primarily for drones and helicopters, so area surveyors. There's been a little bit of money put aside for first aid and trauma ship installations, but the great majority of the money has ended up going to aerial survey work. If you look at the South Australia doesn't have an app similar to what we do in New South Wales and in Western Australia. So again, if you wanted to learn more about chance, etc., you have to go onto their website. Gives the usual information about what you avoid, etc. It does provide some maps of where sharp movements that happens, but it's rudimentary, shall we say. Tasmania, an island to the south of Victoria, that has no shark bite mitigation measures. Shark bites happen very infrequently. Have been 5 fatalities since 1900, but and there's no information about any policies or anything, no websites, no anything. So it was quite surprising. Western Australia, on the other hand, has had, unfortunately, several very severe shark bites in recent years, including Tabadees. They initiated a new shark management program a couple of years ago. At the moment, their budget is about 17 million per year, and the complexity with Western Australia is that it is a huge coastline, and so it's very difficult to try to implement a program along the entire coastline. They have initiated a catch and kill program using drum lines in 2011. It was overseen, it was watched and monitored by the environmental groups who highlighted that most of the sharks that were caught are sharks. They initiated a very effective campaign, I guess, against the shark culling, and to the degree that, in fact, the East Australian government stopped the trial because of the public pressure. The large amount of their current funding has again gone into beach and aerial surveyors. Once again, drones are being used quite effectively there, but they're also still using helicopters. I think something that a lot of places have really thought about, and it's now been put into a bit of turmoil because, as was presented earlier, the personal protection device that has been the most effective, unfortunately, the company no longer exists, and it's been bought by an American business, but we have no idea whether they're going to continue making it. It's the Shark Shield, Ocean Guardian, Freedom 7. But Western Australian government was providing a $200 rebate, so giving you back $200 if you bought one of these devices. So basically subsidizing the device. They've also used beach enclosures, and they have, I'll put here with 7 or 8 each that use these basically plastic nets. They are all at protected beaches, so they've been able to stay in the water, unlike our experience in New South Wales. And like New South Wales and Queensland, certainly WA and surpass WA, be major partners in the government program, again, doing first aid training that is specifically trained full surface, very safe to what's happening in the other states. They've also created, similar to us in New South Wales, a rapid response unit and to develop rapidly to any place that there's been an incident, to deploy John 9s and to assist with management of the people on the ground. I think something really useful that they've done is these beach emergency numbers. They've managed to install 1,800 of these along the coast, and basically each beach access point has an individual number. So if an accident happens, whether it's a boating accident or whether it's a shark attack, the beach is recognized by that number, and the helicopter and the ambulance knows exactly where to go to get to the closest point for the victim. Now, I think that's a really smart system. I should recommend anyone to use that. There's been a legislative ban on cage diving, and there's AUKUS management. In addition, they have got 32 shark monitoring receiver, things similar to us, and they've been doing substantial shark diving in Western Australia to try and understand the needs. So in a nutshell, this just gives you an overview of what the various states do and what the gear is in the water, etc. And you could see that where all this money gauge is. I said earlier, 34 million euro, and it's a lot of work, a lot of effort on certainly Queensland, New South Wales, and Western Australia, I think we're certainly hoping that these initiatives will reduce shark bites.